What's up, everybody? Joe Brown here. This is the Heresy Financial, and man, is this one a doozy. It looks like the United States is trying to weasel its way in there to get a monopoly on CBDCs for every country around the world. It currently exercises a virtual monopoly over the monetary system because of its control of SWIFT, which basically means if you want to send money from one country to another, you've got to use the dollar. If you want to do international trade, that is done by using the SWIFT system, and the US largely controls that. They're trying to use that and leverage that for this next wave of national currencies, which will likely be central bank digital currencies, at least in some countries, so that they can maintain this monopoly over global transactions with the dollar, leverage into getting a monopoly on all CBDCs around the world. Not good. Ready? Let's dive in. All right, take a look with me at this article from Swift.com. We can see that they are currently experimenting ways to use CBDCs in international payments using SWIFT. And so what we're going to get into is how they are trying to use SWIFT to weasel their way into maintaining a monopoly on the global monetary system, even though many countries are switching over to using central bank digital currencies. But before we do that, we have to understand what is a CBDC, because you look around at your everyday life, you open up your banking app, all of your money is digital anyway. So what is the big difference between a CBDC and the way money currently operates? So the best way to understand what a CBDC is as the opposite of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency. It is a ledger-based currency. So what does that mean? It operates like a giant magic billboard that everybody can see all the time. And this billboard lists all the accounts that exist, and it says how much money is in each account at any given time. And all the world can see this at any given time. So if somebody climbs up on this magic billboard, erases one of the account's money and writes in a new amount, everybody can see that happened. So everybody would just say, nope, we're going to put that back because we know that's not real. The other thing is it also records all the transactions that happen. So if somebody was able to get up there and write themselves in some new money, well, you'd be able to see, well, that money didn't come from any of the other accounts. So clearly we can see that's fake. And all the money that's in all the accounts, we can trace that back. The money is in that account because part of it came from there, which before it was there, it came from that account, which before it was in that account, came from that account, all the way back to the very beginning, the Genesis block. That's all blockchain is. It's a public ledger that records all the transactions and all the accounts that hold the money. Bitcoin is pseudonymous, meaning it has like an account number, but not a name associated with it. This is different than like a bank account, which has your name, your birthday, your social security number, all the information about you. And so Bitcoin is pseudonymous. It's got an account number. So it's possible to find out who operates that if you can figure out their IP address and all that. Like it's pretty easy for criminals to get found out, figured out who they were if they use Bitcoin, because it's pretty easy to follow everything back. There's already a paper trail from the actual transactions on Bitcoin's blockchain, so you can just trace that back, find the IP addresses and stuff. So nobody really uses Bitcoin for crime anymore. So it's pseudonymous, it's not anonymous. The other thing about it is that once a transaction happens, nobody can force that transaction to be reversed. They are recorded, those transactions are recorded in the blockchain for eternity, basically. And so once a transaction happens, it can't be reversed. Similarly, if money is sent from one account to another, that can't be stopped. Nobody can come in and say, no, I actually don't want that money to go from point A to point B. It's going to happen. It's censorship resistant. You can't stop that. The last thing about it is that it is decentralized. So the control of the network is spread out over basically all of the users or many of the users. And so you don't have one party able to come in and say, hey, I would like the rules of this to change. Rules could be how much new Bitcoin, how many new Bitcoins are being released into the system every year. So those are rules that were set up at the beginning. And if those rules ever wanted to change, you'd have to make a competing cryptocurrency, which there are plenty of those, or you'd have to have everybody on the network virtually agree to those changes. And so that's basically, a very quick overview of Bitcoin. And so we need to understand that a central bank digital currency is exactly the opposite of that. It's a ledger based currency instead of a debt-based currency like our current system. but it is not a public ledger. So I described the big magic billboard before. It's the exact opposite of that. Only a few people will be able to see everything that is happening on this ledger. And the reason for that is because it also won't be anonymous or pseudonymous. It'll be just like your current bank account where they have all your information. So you're going to have basically one bank that has everybody's money, all the accounts for all the businesses and all the individuals. It will bypass the traditional banking system, go up to the central bank, and they'll be able to have all of the accounts with all of the money and see all the transactions. And so they'll be very secure because of that, because they don't want that all that information getting into the wrong hands. It's not pseudonymous, it's not anonymous, it's got all your information. It also is private, so nobody else is able to see to verify the transactions that are happening. The central bank will be the only ones who can see that. Further, it is not censorship resistant. It is fully programmable by the central control over the currency. That means that if they want to change the rules about how much money is being created, they can do so because they're the ones in control of the network instead of having all the users be in control of the network. And so when you have, let's say, the need for economic stimulus and stimulus checks to go out, you don't have to pass something through Congress. You don't have to rely on the IRS to write checks and get those out. All you have to do, type in a few keystrokes on the computer and credit everybody's account with $1,000 extra. Now, let's say you're concerned that that money might be spent on stocks and cause a stock bubble. Few more strokes of the keyboard, you can say this money can be spent on food, gas, rent, but it won't work if you try and transfer it into a brokerage account, for instance, to buy stocks, or into a crypto exchange to buy Bitcoin. So you can program the money to be used for certain things, not for other things, or put an expiration date on it. Say this can only be used during a specific amount of time, and if you don't use it, it expires. That way it forces the money out into the system instead of writing everybody a bunch of stimulus checks and them just keeping it in their savings account. We wouldn't want people to save. That would be disastrous for the economy, right? And so central bank digital currency, number one, it centralizes the control over all financial accounts to one entity, the central bank, instead of distributing that control among a bunch of banks, or in the case of Bitcoin, distributing that control among all of the users. The second thing it does is transfer all of the data of all of those transactions to that central board. You can do with that what you will. Maybe you think that's good, maybe you think that's bad. The next thing that it does is transfer all the control from fiscal policy, monetary policy, from using a blunt force instrument like raising interest rates, lowering interest rates, quantitative tightening, quantitative easing. It divides all of those tools up into much finer tools. It's using a scalpel instead of a hammer for surgery. So they can go in and they can say, hey, we can stop transactions from happening at gas stations over a certain amount per month because gas hoarders are causing gas prices to go up. And so they can exercise much more control over the economy using these fine-tuning dials with a central bank digital currency. Just in case you're not terrified yet, this is tyranny. It is 100% totalitarian control over the economy, which the economy is everything. It's almost all of human action. And so having this degree of control over human action is, by definition, totalitarian, authoritarianism, 100% control. It is tyranny, and this is the number one threat that our country and any country faces, economically speaking, is the implementation of central bank digital currencies, because whether they use the power or not, the power to control people to that extent is dangerous in and of itself and should be resisted with everything possible that we can resist it with. But it gets better, or worse. If we take a look again here at this article from Swift, new experiments are paving the way for international payments using CBDCs. What is going on here? If CBDCs weren't bad enough, imagine a global CBDC. Imagine a global system that has an element of control over all of the national central bank digital currencies. That means you've got local tyranny in all these sovereign places that are establishing their own central bank digital currencies. But if that rolls out, then you have competing currencies. You don't want competing currencies as a totalitarian dictator, somebody who wants to control the resources around the entire world, because then with competition, you have incentive structures aligned with the people who are using them. So if I don't like the CBDC that's used in this little small country because it's benefiting the government and not me, I can leave and go to a different one and use a different currency that's in that other country. If all these little countries start implementing their own central bank digital currencies, which right now there are 9 countries already live with their own digital currency, 9 out of 10 of these central banks account for more than 90% of global GDP. So the world is trying to move this direction, and if it happens, and it is completely decentralized in terms of each country, you have more competition over money, and people can start to choose the monetary systems that meet their needs best, which right now, the dollar has a huge amount of leverage around the world because most international trade is done in dollars. And that's what they're trying to avoid here. They're trying to avoid the shift away from the global power that they have with the dollar and SWIFT right now to competing currencies, with every country starting up its own CBDC. And while that would be bad, you still have competition forcing the incentives to align with the people using it so that these countries don't start having wealth drain and brain drain from exercising too much totalitarian control over their people. But SWIFT is trying to stop that here. The chief innovation officer at SWIFT says that facilitating interoperability and interlinking between different CBDCs being developed around the world will be critical if we are to fully realize their potential. Because right now, most of the focus on CBDCs is about helping achieve domestic policy goals. So the big blind spot here is international payments, going from one country's CBDC that they, let's say, fully adopt to another country's CBDC that they fully adopted. How do you get from one to the other? And they say there's a risk that the CBDC ecosystem becomes fragmented, with numerous central banks developing their own digital currencies based on different technologies, standards, and protocols. They warn that this could lead to digital islands springing up across the globe. Different systems, different CBDCs, would hamper the ability of businesses and consumers to make frictionless cross-border payments using CBDCs. They're not worried about the consumer having frictionless payments. They're worried about competition destroying their global monopoly on money. And so they have begun conducting a set of experiments demonstrating they could successfully orchestrate a cross-border transaction between one entity on a DLT-based CBDC network and a second one running on an established real-time gross settlement system. But that was just one experiment. They're moving on to the next level. They're collaborating with Capgemini to test how SWIFT can interlink the multiple domestic-based networks emerging worldwide to make cross-border payments more seamless and frictionless. Again, it is not about making cross-border payments frictionless for consumers. This is about controlling the plumbing of the global financial system as everybody moves away to their own currency, making sure that you control the highways connecting one country to another. Global monopoly on money. They say that navigating decentralization is complex. There are many technology choices, operating models, policy considerations, but their well-defined taxonomy has helped accelerate efforts to build CBDC interlinks with SWIFT. So essentially, they're using this as a scapegoat, that every CBDC will be built slightly differently when taking into account monetary policy and the technology and the framework behind it. And so communicating from one to another in terms of payments can be difficult. So they're going to come in, say everybody set it up in a way that it can communicate with SWIFT with little friction seamlessly. And then SWIFT will be the pipelines connecting every country's CBDCs with each other. Again, controlling the pipelines of the financial system, having a monopoly on global money. And like I said before, this is tyranny. And if the CBDC in one country is tyranny, how much more so if you control the highways between every single country's own CBDC? Only that much more so. To be honest, there is not much, if anything, people like you and I can do. This is just something we need to keep our eyes open for, watch what's happening, and get some of your wealth out of the financial system before it's too late. Once the on-rails and the off-rails are fully controlled, you may not be able to buy gold. You may not be able to buy silver. You may not be able to buy pew-pews. You may not be able to buy Bitcoin. You may not be able to buy other cryptocurrencies. You may not be able to buy food in excess of what they say or deem is appropriate. You may not be able to buy water in excess of what they say is appropriate. You may not be able to buy fuel in excess of what they say is appropriate. But whenever tyranny sets in, black markets always pop up. And so the key will be making sure you have wealth, something that somebody wants, some value you can provide to them outside of the rails that are watched and controlled by the tyrannical top-down totalitarian system, because if you don't have it outside the system already, by the time it's too late, it may be very difficult, near impossible, to get most of that wealth outside the system to be able to operate with freedom. Parallel markets, black markets may be very difficult, if not impossible, to get there. If you want my recommendations on where to buy gold and Bitcoin and other things like that, you know I always have resources with affiliate links in the description below. As always, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.